Joined by Matthew Continetti. Matthew is the Director of Domestic Policies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a co-host of the Commentary podcast, which is a must-listen to. The author most recently of The Right, a bestseller, and a frequent visitor to Fox News and other television stations. Good morning, Matt. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Hugh. Thanks for having me.
I did not know until yesterday that you studied Japanese for years. And I did not know that there was a second season of Tokyo Vice until yesterday. I love Tokyo Vice, and I don't particularly like Japan. I mean, I like the Japanese people, but Japan I find overwhelming. It turns out you like Japan.
I do. I'm fascinated by Japanese culture, the Japanese civilization. Hugh, I'm a little younger than you, and so I kind of came of age at the time of Rising Sun, the Michael Crichton book, and the idea that, the Japanese were going to take over the world, eat America's lunch, America in decline. And so that inspired me to start studying Japanese, which I did throughout high school and into college. Of course, I should have been taking Mandarin, but that's just more evidence, I think, that all of these fads of American declinism are generational, and at the end of the day,
it's better to know the allies.
America triumphs.
It's better to know the languages of our allies when we go to war, Matt, because then you'll be useful in Japan. But I do have a question before we get into serious stuff. I found Japan to be the most different culture of any other culture. I've been around the world. I've been blessed. I've gone lots of places, you name it. I've almost been there except New Zealand, which I'm saving for retirement. And so I've experienced a lot of different cultures. I think Japan is the most different from America of anywhere I've been. What do you think?
I think that's fair to say. I think that's one reason I was interested in studying the language and interested in visiting. It's an extremely mannered culture. Politeness and decorum and tradition is extremely important, deference. So as a conservative, I was also interested in all of those aspects. But what's funny about Japanese culture is, as different as it may seem from Western culture, the way in which the Japanese appropriate Western ideas and then refashion them, and then for a culture that's also considered very conformist from outsiders' perspective, there are some real interesting Japanese eccentrics. I mean, truly visionary artists and kind of unique figures. So I encourage young people to learn Japanese and to study Japan, because, as you're absolutely right, Hugh, it is good to know our allies and I think build on that relationship now over 75 years old.
And I also know that you and J-Pod were talking yesterday about Shogun. The first Shogun may have been the worst television series ever made, so they can't get worse than this. But Tokyo Vice is fabulous. And you pronounce Yakuza differently than any way I've ever heard it pronounced, so I've obviously been mispronouncing it, but that's nothing new. Let's get to serious stuff, Matt. I think the Commentary podcast is the best podcast available. I listen to it immediately after the Times of Israel, which is only 25 minutes. It's a news show. And then I do the hour of commentary. I want you to do 2 hours. I want you to do it twice a day, so pass that along to the gang. But you're all way too sanguine about Joe Biden and Israel. You're all way too. They're not going to screw us. Here are some headlines. PM vetoes future Cairo negotiations. That's from the Times of Israel. Israeli jets hit Lebanon in heaviest strike since Gaza war began. IDF credible evidence Hamas held hostages in Khan Yunis Nasser Hospital. Wall Street Journal. Biden-Netanyahu relationship at boiling point as Rafah invasion looms. David Cameron. This from the Times of Israel. Israel must ensure aid reaches Gazans, will breach international law if it doesn't. Germany and France, this is from the Times of Israel, fear humanitarian catastrophe in Rafah. And then this one, U.S. Arab allies reportedly set to propose Palestinian statehood plan within weeks. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but Israel suffered the greatest massacre at the hands of terrorists since 9/11. They are our ally. They have been very careful in their treatment of civilians. They have set the standard for urban warfare, and we are leaning on them. And I think it's because Arabists, old and new, and the far left of the Democratic Party, and a president who is impaired don't know what they're doing. And you guys, You all think it's going to be fine. I think they're going to stab Israel in the back.
Well, I'm not sure I've ever said it's going to be fine. I think it's been extraordinary how Biden has gone from his initial position after the massacre of October 7th, comparing Hamas to ISIS, to where he is today, where he's spending much more time trying to constrain Israel's actions and freedom of maneuver and trying to prevent Israel from entering Hamas's final stronghold, where the remaining hostages are, where the remaining leadership of Hamas is, where the remaining organized military brigades of Hamas are located. I think that's a travesty. And I think you're right. The reasons for it have to do with Biden's condition. It has to do with the left-wing tilt of his administration's staff, the growing importance, I think, of politically correct, progressive Arabist politics, and then also the domestic policy concerns, or rather the domestic political concerns that Biden has about Michigan. There was a very interesting Fox News poll yesterday, Hugh. We didn't get a chance to talk about it on Special Report, but it was of the state of Michigan, and it showed Trump with a narrow lead over Biden. It showed that among all Michiganders, support for Israel remains very strong, and that remains the case nationwide as well. But among Democrats, the Democrats in Michigan were split 37-37 between Israel and Hamas. And I think that that is what is motivating Biden's actions. And I think it's irresponsible of him. It's irresponsible not just in the way he is treating our allies and treating the Jewish state, the only nation whose existence seems to come under question and scrutiny. It's also politically irresponsible for him. The fact is, there are many more votes from the pro-Israel community than there are for people who take the side of the Palestinian leadership or who sympathize with Hamas. So I don't understand why he is going down this path, other than he is simply not in control of events, when he should be following the path of, say, a Democratic senator like John Fetterman of Pennsylvania.
Matt, I have a suggestion, which might be that the president, after reading the Hur report, I don't say this cavalierly, I've said he's infirm for a long time. Now I believe he's impaired, and I think the 8-track tape in his head reverts back to the peace processes of Oslo and before and after that have all failed, and that he's just remembering stuff that isn't applicable post 10/7. All of Israel, like 99% of Israel, want to finish off Hamas, and the same amount want nothing to do with Gaza. But they're not going to let this happen again. And you know the old cliche, that which gets rewarded gets repeated. Do you think we could try praising Israel's restraint in the waging of a war of survival? And they have been so very careful in their approach to the war in Gaza. Do you think we might praise them at some point for their restraint?
It would be helpful. It would be worthy to do that. And we should recall, too, that the IDF has taken great pains at following America's advice in order to reduce civilian casualties, thereby actually increasing the risk to Israeli soldiers. And what's remarkable, actually, is the number of Israeli killed in action since the war began is relatively small. And I think that testifies to the skill of the IDF. There is this narrative, Hugh, that has taken hold in the American media that somehow Israel is losing the war or the war is unwinnable. That is not so. And I thought it was very important for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to go on American television over the weekend and say that 3/4 of the Hamas military brigades have been destroyed. The victory can be achieved. And what's important now is for Biden to retain his original commitment to Israel that he said in the aftermath of October 7th. He called Hamas ISIS. And when America decided to go to war against ISIS, we didn't stop. We didn't say, all right, there's one last city, we're not going to go in because of fear of humanitarian consequences. It's important, I think, for Biden to continue down his original path and not the path he's taken in recent weeks, which will only lead to further violence. Hugh, the Middle East is on fire. We're involved in a low-intensity conflict.
That
and
could
he
be
needs a
high
strategy.
intensity. We could be doing the full regional war by the time this podcast and radio show are over today. I'm back now with Matt Continetti, who is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the author most recently of The Right, and a co-host of the Commentary Pod. Matt, I want to ask you about the Commentary Pod. When do you guys find the time to do that? Because you're all very busy people. And I want more. Like, I want 3 hours a day like I do. And I want more of Christine and John and Matt and the rest of the gang. Abe, I've never met Abe, but he sure has got a great radio voice. Please keep him out of radio. And I think Bethany's husband, that's how I refer to him, is wonderful as well. So when do you do that? And how much time does it take?
Well, Hugh, having been in radio, it takes a lot of preparation. And we do it in the mornings. That's an understatement, right?
Well,
and I never had this experience.
We don't do any preparation around here.
Oh, really? Okay, maybe I've been doing it wrong then. Because since I've been on the podcast now for about a year, my day begins, and all I care about until we finish the pod is preparing for it, knowing what's going on in the news, trying to figure out what my take is. And what's been helpful to me is to kind of read the news through the lens of some of the thinkers who have been most important to me. So nowadays, when I prepare for the Commentary podcast, I always think to myself, what would Charles Krauthammer say? How would he approach the news, and how would he think about current events with his principles and values in mind? And so that's kind of my heuristic. That's kind of my shortcut to prepare for the podcast. And it does take some time, but we're usually done by, I'd say, 10 a.m. in the morning, and then we can begin the rest of our day.
It's a great lens. And I'm joking about not being prepared. You guys are obviously prepared. I don't know how you guys find the time to read and watch everything when the Commentary Recommends comes along. I'm always overwhelmed, although I was glad to hear about Tokyo Vice yesterday. I am curious, have you got audience stats? Because my guess is Commentary Pod has gone through the roof since 10/7, like Dan Senor's Call Me Back.
We do. I don't know the exact numbers, but I've always been pleasantly surprised at the size of the Commentary podcast audience. And more importantly for me, the loyalty of the audience and the responsiveness of the audience. Not having been in radio, having spent my career mainly in print journalism, I was kind of taken aback by how the relationship between a podcast or a radio program and its audience forms. And so that's been a great pleasure for me to get to hear from the audience, get to interact with them. And you really get a sense that the program matters. And I think the program has mattered even more since October 7th. And definitely there's been growth in the audience since then. I know that we're listened to intently on Capitol Hill as well. And of course, as a Beltway boy, that's very important to me.
I have a theory, which is, and we have a minute to the break, is that quality news is rare. Brett Baer's show is the exception, special report. And I try and do quality news in the morning, but commentary can be listened to whenever anyone is around. And my theory is it's going to keep growing because it's quality news and commentary. And you guys aren't afraid to say, I got that wrong, or I don't know, or to disagree with each other, Seth, etc. So my hat is off to you. Don't say anything. We got to come back from a break. In the world of radio, we have these things called commercials, and so I have to come back from them. Don't go anywhere, Matt Continetti. I'll be right back with more of Matt on The Hugh Hewitt Show. But Matt Continetti is my guest, Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, co-host of Commentary Pod, which you ought to download, follow, comment on, and also, of course, the author of The Right. Matt, I want to turn to the Republican Party. I have a piece over at Fox News today. I write for the Washington Post and Fox News. Matt writes for everybody. I don't know. I don't think Matt sleeps. And it really offends me because I used to have that reputation of being the more prolific person on the right. But now Matt is actually the most prolific person on the right. Matt, I think Tom Cotton ought to be his vice president because you need someone in the mold of Nixon in 52 for Eisenhower. You need a generation changer, and you need a hard-edged attack vehicle. What do you make of my argument?
I think Tom would be a great choice, Hugh. I think he's strong. I think he fits the mold of the Jacksonians who support Donald Trump, people who don't want to take it anymore from the federal government, who believe in law and order, who are border hawks, and who are hawkish on foreign policy when America is attacked and want to respond. Tom's a great communicator, and I think he has an excellent strategic sense, but also a political sense. He is very savvy about American politics and has that, of course, that great experience in the Senate. So he would definitely be on my vice presidential shortlist, though, of course, as we know, Trump is considering other names as well.
Yeah, now I want to raise the question of timing, because the former president's going to be in trial. If Jack Smith has his way, he'll be in handcuffs for the next 9 months. And the Supreme Court should put a stop to that. But assuming he doesn't, if you name your running mate early, that running mate can raise money and campaign and be on every show all the time. Is that an argument, not just for Cotton, but for anyone being named early?
I think the timing is important here. I think you're absolutely right, because we're entering this campaign where both of the major candidates will be off stage. Biden because his staff secludes him from the public, and Trump because he may be occupied by the trials if they go forward. So you do need to name a vice presidential selection, I think, earlier in the cycle than usual, just so you have a surrogate out there who can fundraise, who can attack, who can appear in the media. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Trump names a vice presidential nominee shortly after he wraps up the nomination, which could be within the next month or so.
Now, I think the Republican Party is on the precipice of a fatal error if they do not pass aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan immediately. I understand some of the hawks want to make a run at amending the supplemental with H.R. 2 and sending it back. This is a mistake. If we're worried about Russian nukes in space, and we are this morning, we ought to be worried about Russia on the ground. Why have we not moved the supplemental already, Matt, and then come back to the border? It doesn't make a lick of sense to me.
I think there's some paralysis in the leadership, Hugh. I think there's some worry about potential blowback from the anti-Ukraine aid Republicans if Speaker Johnson allows a vote on this legislation. I think he should allow a vote on the national security legislation. Newt Gingrich talked about 70-30 issues. Well, the vote in the Senate was 70-29 for aid to Israel and Ukraine. This is a 70-30 issue, and I don't think we should allow a minority of the House of Representatives and, a significant portion of the Republican Party, but not the entirety of the Republican Party, hold up this legislation. Let the vote go. It will pass 3/4 of the House of Representatives, and it will show Vladimir Putin that America is still involved in the world and that we're still going to supply weapons that were produced in the United States to our allies in Israel and Ukraine so they can resist aggression.
One savvy person told me that the Republicans who are normally hawkish in the House are afraid of primary challenges. That's nonsense. It's too late in the game to mount a primary challenge. If they vote for a discharge petition and vote this aid, it sends a signal not only to Russia, but to Speaker Johnson and the Republican Party that we're still the party of Reagan. And I heard your conversation earlier this week that we're not, but I think we are. And I think Donald Trump is very much a peace through strength Republican, though he's much less inclined to get involved than W, for example, in foreign wars. But do you think his advice is to do nothing at this point? Because that is playing into Putin's hands.
I think Trump wants a situation where he is in charge. And so he would rather not anything major happen until he comes into office next year. But I think for the sake of American security and for the sake of the world, America does need to move this legislation. We need to replenish our defense industrial base. It has atrophied, and the way to do it is by passing the supplemental.
Urgency is the tone of the day. Matt Continenti on X at Continenti. Go find Commentary Podcast at iTunes, Spotify, anywhere where you find podcasts. Subscribe, follow it. Be smarter every day. When you're done with the Hugh Hewitt Show, go immediately to the Commentary Pod and the Times of Israel Pod, and you'll be the best informed of Americans.